This is one of my favorite stops on the Freedom Trail, and this is the Granary Burying Ground. It's just a fun cemetery, if you can call a cemetery fun. It is so old. It dates back to 1660. It's the third oldest cemetery in Boston, but there are a lot of famous people that are buried here. Now, they estimate that there's probably about 5,000 bodies in the cemetery. However, there are only about 2,500 headstones. And these headstones have been rearranged a few times because with the invention of the modern lawnmower, it made it much easier to put the headstones in rows so that we could mow in between them. Now let's talk about some of the famous people that are buried here. We have, in that corner, we have Samuel Adams, the famous Sons of Liberty leader, the one who spoke at the Old South Church to get everybody to march down to the tea ships. Samuel Adams, very famous, cousin to John Adams, so he is buried there. Next to him is a marker for the Boston Massacre victims. There were 5 people that were killed in the Boston Massacre, so if you want to call that a massacre, I think it was propaganda to to get people kind of excited and infuriated. But anyway, we'll talk about that when we go to the old State House. And let's see, right smack dab in the middle, there is a very large obelisk-shaped tombstone, and that belongs to the parents of Ben Franklin. And I think some of the family members too. Now, Ben Franklin is not buried in Boston. He moved to Philadelphia as a teenager. He ran off and he's buried in Philadelphia. Now, right behind him, there is a really neat tombstone that belongs to a man named Captain Thomas Andrews. And he died in 1690, and he was one of my ancestors. And he had gone up to the Battle of Quebec to overtake Quebec. And he had contracted smallpox, and he ends up I think he died on the ship back here, but he is buried here as well. He was from a town called Hingham, which is very close to Boston, so I'm not exactly sure why they buried him here at the Granary, but it's kind of cool to have an ancestor buried here. Now, directly behind him, at the very back of the cemetery, is Paul Revere. Now, Paul Revere, again, Sons of Liberty and very involved in the Revolution. Of course, we all know him from the Midnight Ride, but he was quite an activist and entrepreneur as well. He was a silversmith. He had a copper rolling factory. They made bells. In fact, the bell at King's Chapel is one of his bells. And all across New England, lots of churches have Paul Revere bells in them still to this day. But Paul Revere, again, will be another video. Very interesting man. Back in the other corner, you'll find Peter Faneuil. He was the one that gave us Faneuil Hall, and he was a very wealthy man, and he inherited that wealth from his uncle. But his uncle was only going to give him the money on one condition, and that condition was that he never get married. So I think he happily obliged. He even had a boat that he called the Happy Bachelor. Well, he got Faneuil Hall built for us because we were running out of meeting space and we needed a bigger townhouse. Well, unfortunately, the first event that took place at Faneuil Hall is Peter Faneuil's funeral. So, sad to say. Now, directly across from Ben Franklin, and that on this side, you will find a kind of an obelisk shape. It's a very tall, skinny tombstone, which I have a picture of. This belongs to John Hancock. And remember John Hancock, who signed his name very big on the Declaration of Independence. He was also very involved in the Sons of Liberty and the Revolution. And remember when we talked about the mansion next to the new State House that got tore down? That was his home. Okay, yes, I forgot about this. When John Hancock was buried, see, he was wealthy. Apparently he was buried with his rings on, and so grave robbers came to his grave, dug up the grave. They were unable to get those darn rings off, so they had to cut off his hand. So now that's a legend. It could be true, it could not be true, we don't know. And then our last one that we're going to talk about is James Otis Jr. And you probably have not heard of him either, but I am sure that you've heard of the phrase, Taxation without representation is tyranny. That came out of one of his speeches. I believe it was on the writs of assistance that he was giving. John Adams said that James Otis was one of the greatest orators of all time. But anyway, he had kind of a tragic life. He was hit over the head at a coffee house and kind of started going crazy after that. And then he eventually was struck by lightning and died. So those are some of the famous people that are buried here at the Granary Burial Ground. It's a fun cemetery. I know that doesn't sound right to say, but it's a cool cemetery to visit, just to wander around and see some of the old, spooky, amazing headstones. Very, very cool. So anyway, I will see you at the next stop.